Hello, I'm Rachel, and I have something important to share. Something that's been weighing on me for far too long. Before forming an opinion, I invite you to hear my story. I never imagined I would end up in a scenario like this, and I continue to grapple with how everything unraveled so rapidly. This is a haunting memory that has lingered for years, a moment orchestrated by my husband that altered the trajectory of my life. The journey began several years ago. My husband, John, and I had been happily married for nearly a decade. Like many couples, we experienced our share of highs and lows, but I never saw this coming. John was a devoted man. Yet, as time passed, a shift occurred. He grew more distant, increasingly controlling, and noticeably less affectionate. I attempted to brush it off, convincing myself it was merely the pressure from work. Yet, deep within, I recognized that something was amiss. One evening, John returned home from work radiating an unusual energy. He appeared remarkably cheerful, yet there was an almost disquieting quality in the way he gazed at me. We enjoyed our dinner as we always did, and just as I was getting ready to clear the dishes, he invited me to take a seat. His tone was grave, prompting my compliance. As my heart began to race, I realized this conversation was far from ordinary. He began, his gaze drifting away from me, lost in thought. "I have something important to share with you," he said. I nodded, anticipating his next words. But what came next took me by surprise. He expressed a desire to invigorate our relationship, sharing that he had been feeling a sense of monotony and believed it was the perfect moment for us to explore new experiences together. Initially, I assumed he was suggesting a romantic escape or perhaps therapy to reignite the passion. However, what he proposed was quite the opposite. "I've set up a meeting for us with two gentlemen," he stated plainly. "They're coming over this weekend." I gazed at him, completely puzzled by his intentions. I couldn't tell if he was playing around or if this was some twisted challenge, but his face was utterly grave. A knot formed in my stomach, and a surge of nausea swept through me. "What are you referring to with two men?" I inquired, my voice scarcely above a whisper. He said it nonchalantly, as if it were perfectly ordinary. "They're friends of mine. We're set to enjoy an unforgettable night together alongside them." I was left utterly speechless. My hands shook as I struggled to grasp his words. This was not my husband. This was not the person I had promised to share my life with. He spoke of inviting two strangers into our home, into our marriage, as if it were a trivial matter. The mere thought of it turned my stomach. Yet beyond that, a sense of betrayal washed over me. "John, have you lost your senses?" At last, I found the words, my voice trembling with a blend of disbelief and fury. "This does not represent who we are. What could possibly motivate you to?" Just as I was about to wrap up, he interrupted me. "Rachel, this is happening," he declared, his tone cutting through the air. "It's essential to grasp this concept. I desire it, a necessity we require." I was in disbelief at what I was hearing. I cared for John deeply, yet I found it hard to grasp why he was urging me towards something so humiliating, a moment that threatened to dismantle everything we had created together. I firmly stated that I would not proceed with it. I believed that would mark the conclusion, that he would finally realize the truth and abandon the notion. I was mistaken. In the days that followed, John became increasingly withdrawn. He barely engaged with me unless the conversation revolved around the plan. He began arriving home late, and when I inquired about his whereabouts, he provided ambiguous responses. The atmosphere shifted, transforming our once vibrant home into a space heavy with unspoken words and a stifling quiet that overshadowed the love we once shared. I experienced a sense of entrapment, isolation, and bewilderment. How did our marriage end up like this? As Friday approached, a heavy sense of dread took root in my chest. John firmly maintained that the meeting would take place regardless of my objections. I thought about gathering my belongings and stepping out for good. However, I chose not to, despite my reluctance to acknowledge it. A part of me clung to the image of the man I believed I understood, wishing this was merely a passing phase. There's an opportunity for us to collaborate on this. I thought. I wasn't prepared to let go of the life we built together. Yet, I found myself unable to endure the idea of following through with his plan. Saturday evening came all too fast. The men who claimed to be Jay's friends showed up right on time at 8 p.m. I sat on the couch, my hands tightly clasped in my lap, fighting to keep the tears at bay. I was completely unaware of their names, and yet here they were, comfortably seated in my living room, chatting with my husband as if they were longtime friends. The atmosphere crackled with intensity. I sensed their gaze fixed upon me, observing, anticipating. I felt an overwhelming urge to vanish, to dash out of the house and leave it all behind. Then Jayan leaned in closer, his hand gently placed on my knee. "Rachel, the moment has arrived," he murmured softly. I stood, paralyzed, my thoughts urging me to rise and escape. Yet my body remained unyielding. Jayan's hand rested heavily on my knee, grounding me firmly in the moment. I found it impossible to meet his gaze, and the sight of the two men across from me was equally unmanageable. My heart raced wildly, and the walls of the room felt like they were closing in on me. "If you could," Jayan repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper filled with a sense of urgency. His tone had a quality that caused me to hesitate. It was more than mere insistence. It was a moment of sheer desperation. After days of watching, I finally caught a glimpse of vulnerability in his eyes. This went beyond merely fulfilling a distorted desire for him. It revolved around control, power, and an elusive depth that remained just out of reach. However, that didn't justify it. "John, I can't do this," I finally whispered, my voice trembling. "This does not reflect our true identity." He let out a deep sigh and reclined in his seat. He rubbed his temples, overwhelmed by frustration. "Do you really believe this is what I desire?" he murmured, seemingly lost in his own thoughts rather than addressing me directly. "This is all for us. Rachel, do you not understand that?" "Absolutely not," I responded with a newfound determination. "This is all about you. John, you've transformed. This has moved beyond us. It's all about having control." For a brief instant, I believed I caught a glimpse of guilt flicker across his face, but it vanished just as swiftly. He clenched his jaw and stood up, pacing the room like a man adrift. I felt compelled to connect with him, to bring him back to the person I once recognized. However, I was unsure of the way to proceed. We had drifted so far from our starting point, and I couldn't help but wonder if we would ever navigate our way back. As the silence lingered in the air, one of the men, whom we'll refer to as Marcus, cleared his throat. He appeared to pick up on the tension, yet an unmistakable impatience lingered around him. "Listen," he stated, his tone steady yet assertive. "If this isn't taking place, it might be best for us to head out." I lifted my gaze to him, and in that moment, I truly saw him for the first time. He didn't meet my expectations. He exuded calmness and respect, his demeanor appearing more sympathetic than I had anticipated. I had constructed a notion in my mind that these men were predators, yet they were not. They were simply individuals. In a way, that only added to the overall confusion of the situation. I had no desire to remain. I had no desire to be involved in whatever this was turning into. Yet, the burden of it all, the years spent with John, the love we once knew, The lingering hope that perhaps things could return to how they were held me in place. I was at a loss for what to do next. I found myself ensnared, overwhelmed by the weight of my own uncertainty. John then spoke, his voice calm yet determined. "Rachel, if you walk away, it's over for us." The word struck me with the force of a gut punch. I stared at him, struggling to wrap my mind around his words. He had set a clear boundary, and I was faced with the decision of which side to align myself with. Tears threatened to spill from my eyes, yet I held them at bay, determined not to let him witness my vulnerability. "I've given you everything," he continued, his voice unwavering yet frigid. "I have cared for you, supported you, and all I seek in return is this one simple thing." I rose to my feet, my legs trembling yet resolute. "This isn't love, John," I murmured, my voice barely rising above a whisper. "This is a form of manipulation." His eyes burned with fury, yet I felt indifferent. I was unable to accomplish this. This is not something I would pursue. I faced the door, bracing myself for the inevitable shout, the forceful grip, the desperate attempt to hold me back. However, he did not. I caught him muttering under his breath something along the lines of, "You'll regret this." Perhaps I would. Perhaps departing was an error. In that instant, I realized it was time to step away. I refused to let John or anyone else push me into a situation that didn't sit well with me. Stepping outside, the cool evening air brushed against my face, stirring a peculiar blend of relief and heartbreak within me with each step. My legs propelled me down the street while my thoughts raced ahead. Where should I head to? What should I do? All I felt was an overwhelming sense of betrayal and an aching loss with no answers in sight. After what seemed like an eternity of wandering, I finally stood before the familiar facade of my best friend Sarah's house. I rapped on the door, hoping she was inside. As she opened the door and caught sight of my tear-streaked face, no questions were asked. She enveloped me in a warm embrace and guided me indoors. In the days that followed, I remained with Sarah, working to make sense of all that had transpired. I experienced a profound emptiness, as if a piece of my very being had been ripped away. I felt a pang of longing for John, yet deep down, I understood that returning wasn't an option. The harm was irreversible, and the shattered pieces could never be mended. John attempted to reach me multiple times, leaving voicemails that fluctuated between remorseful and furious. He was unpredictable, and I struggled to stay in sync with his fluctuating feelings. After ignoring all of his calls, he eventually gave up on reaching out. As the months rolled by, I started to piece my life back together, step by step. I initiated the divorce process, fully aware that our marriage had reached a point of no return. Making that decision was the toughest challenge I had ever faced, yet it ultimately proved to be the right choice. I had to walk away from a relationship that involved manipulation and pressure to compromise my core beliefs. Occasionally, I find myself reflecting on John and the life we might have shared had circumstances taken a different turn. I've come to understand that I am worthy of more. I am worthy of a love founded on trust, respect, and mutual understanding rather than control and manipulation.